Good afternoon. I am Renée Ater, a Provost Visiting Associate Professor in Africana Studies. Today you are at an event entitled This is America, a series of conversations about racial slavery, its legacies, and anti-Black racism. Today we are going to have a fabulous conversation with a group of designers, architects, and the conversation is entitled Design Practices Memorializing Difficult Histories. The event is sponsored by the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice and Africana Studies, Rights and Reasons. And a reminder that next week we will have the third of these conversations with a group of Black monument builders, and including an ephemeral monument, a kind of interventionist artist. And that will be next Tuesday, April 20th, from 4 to 5:30. And we already did Memorializing Black Death last week. So I hope that you are continuing to attend the conversations, and next week should also be equally lively. So today we will have presentations. I'm just going to introduce our groups to us so that, and then let them get to their presentations. So to begin, we will have Katie McDonald and Kyle Schuman of After Architecture, and their design for the Camp Barker Memorial at the Garrison Elementary School in Washington, D.C. Kate and Kyle are co-founders of After Architecture, and both are assistant professors of architecture at the University of Virginia. After Architecture is a design practice named to convey the built environment's impact on culture and ecologies. The firm's work explores how technology can help reconcile the intentions of the designer with the irregularity of natural materials and processes, leveraging data and feedback to reframe the relationship between computation, biology, and authorship. So thank you, Katie and Kyle. Shane Albrighton and Norman Lee are co-founders of Recite Studio. Today they will talk about their memorial From Absence to Presence, a commemorative to enslaved persons of Southern Maryland at St. Mary's College. Their work explores notions of community, identity, and narrative in the context of public space. Drawing on the site's cultural landscape, they create work that resonates with local or historical meaning, making unseen connections between themes and ideas. Their practice combines divergent aesthetics with interpretive design and fine art backgrounds. And then we will hear from Julian Arrington and Dayton Schroeder of the Smith Group, one of their offices located here in Washington, D.C. They will talk about a really powerful work that was installed briefly on the Smithsonian Mall entitled Society's Cage, Experiential Installation here in Washington, D.C. They are lead designers at the Smith Group and lead designers of the Society's Cage installation. Founded in 1853, it's got a long history. The Smith Group maintains 14 offices in U.S. cities and an office in Shanghai. Today, the Smith Group name reflects their emergence from several talented regional practices to a united award-winning firm practicing around the globe. So please join me in welcoming both Kate McDonald and Kyle Schuman, who will give our first presentation. Thank you.
Well, we wanted to start off by thanking Renée for the invitation. We're really moved by the work that you're doing to bring together and unpack the kind of recording of slavery's legacy in the built environment. And we're humbled to be included in this series of conversations and alongside these esteemed designers. So I'm Katie McDonald.
And I'm Kyle Schuman.
And originally from Los Angeles and suburban New Jersey, respectively, our kind of academic careers have brought us into the South over the last several years, and in turn, in closer proximity to the landscapes of slavery. Most recently, we are based in Charlottesville, Virginia, a town still shaken by the 2017 white supremacist rally, which heightened national attention to the sustained symbolism of Confederate Civil War monuments in this region. The memorial, which we will present today, the Camp Barker Memorial, was designed and commissioned in early 2017 and completed in mid-2019. The project's development in this period, when the role of Civil War monuments has been kind of reconsidered by the larger public, has allowed the project to advocate for and demonstrate the significance of counter-narratives. Located in Northeast Washington, D.C., the Camp Barker Memorial responds to the landscape of American monuments that valorize performance in battle, instead taking form as a series of thresholds which convey a complex history, in particular, the site's role in providing shelter to those escaping slavery. We would like to begin by thanking and acknowledging the profound contribution of our client and collaborators on this project. Thank you to Sandy Bellamy, who administers the DC Department of General Services Public Art Program, and whose vision and tireless dedication to making meaningful public art part of Washington, DC's landscape really allowed this project to be commissioned and realized. And thank you also to Vinnie Bagwell, who contributed the project's narrative reliefs and who is a sculptor of the highest caliber. Her larger body of work advocates for and brings to life African-American histories and narratives in the public realm. And then we'd also like to thank engineer Yoon Associates, fabricator Bruce Baldwin, and photographer Sam Oberter for their contributions to the project.
So L'Enfant's plan for Washington, D.C. laid out the capital with a grid of secondary streets punctured by diagonal grand avenues, the intersections of which create circles and plazas that anticipate central objectified monuments. The avenues point toward the National Mall, a central commons punctuated by object buildings, the White House, the Capitol, the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, among others. This landscape extends a longstanding model of heroic memory, propagated in cities and public spaces worldwide. For instance, the collection of transplanted Egyptian obelisks that pin together the urban spaces of Rome. A notable exception is Maya Lin's controversial Vietnam Veterans Memorial, offering welcome relief from the mall's parade of objects with its cut through the landscape. The project was not initially warmly received by the veteran community. Philosopher Adrian Parr wrote that the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was, quote, seen by many veterans as a way to transform them from a subjugated to a dominant subject position. They clearly expressed the desire to have a memorial that used the standard visual vocabulary common to most monuments constructed in memory of war. Bronze, marble, figurative, a strong vertical structure on a pedestal with an indisputable representation of the veteran as a national war hero. One solution that was proposed entailed changing the wall from black to white, raising the wall to sit above the ground, and to add a flagpole at the vertex with an American flag, in effect turning the wall into a classical pedestal base, lending support to a more nationalistically defined gesture waving the stars and stripes, end quote. Recently, public historical markers have begun to shift from heroic war monuments that inspire pride to markers which shed light on and address injustice and erasures. In 2020, some 2 centuries after its founding, the University of Virginia physically acknowledges the role of slavery in its creation, with Howler and Yoon and Mabel O. Wilson's memorial to enslaved laborers. While Jefferson's contouring of the earth obscured slave labor from view, a new ring of granite embeds the terrain with a reminder that slavery shaped the very land below. Others have confronted the heroic monument by reimagining the hero. Kehinde Wiley's Rumors of War draws gravitas from its sighting at the end of Monument Avenue in Richmond, a grand boulevard marked to this day by Confederate heroes on horseback. Wiley's equestrian, a black man clad in streetwear, elevates an identity rather than an individual hero, a rebuke to the capital of the Confederacy and its depiction of Southern patriarchy.
The Camp Barker Memorial answers a brief for the design of 3 entry gateways to an elementary school by framing and revealing the site's history as a Civil War era contraband camp. A typology specific to the Civil War, the contraband camp holds a complicated legacy. The typology emerged from a legal loophole. Because Confederate forces considered enslaved people, quote, property, unquote, Union forces were able to negate the Fugitive Slave Act, which called for those who had escaped enslavement to be returned to their enslavers. Instead, the rules of war allowed for the confiscation of enslaved people as contraband property. While contraband camps thus became a step toward freedom, where those escaping slavery sought refuge from Southern enslavement, Union forces continued to limit occupant rights. Camp Barker was initially constructed as a Union barracks, but its use shifted to become a contraband camp, which provided housing for those escaping slavery, to some 4,000 residents total over its lifespan. Occupants experienced cramped, poorly ventilated spaces, food and clothing shortages, and poor sanitary conditions. Residents worked for meager wages, but did gain access to education and religious gatherings. In the years following the Civil War, the site gave birth to a long-standing African-American community just blocks from the heart of the Capitol. Prior to the construction of the memorial, no visible trace of the former living quarters or an indication of the site's importance existed, though human remains and artifacts have been unearthed. The site now functions as the campus of Garrison Elementary School in the present day. The memorial portals simultaneously address the history of the site and its recreational grounds. In contrast to the elevated equestrian monument of General John Logan, just blocks from the site at Logan Circle, the memorial takes the monument off its pedestal and puts it at eye level, physically and visually accessible to the public. Intervening in each of the 3 fenced elevations, visitors must pass through a series of memorial thresholds to access the grounds. The site, which encompasses an entire urban block, is bounded by the linear school building to the north, while fencing on the east, west, and south sides enclose the school grounds, which double as a public park. Gates incorporated into each portal can be closed while children are out on recess, but otherwise remain open to the public. The project deliberately establishes a distinct visual identity from the white marble landmarks that define Washington, D.C., and the classical trappings of the region's buildings. It calls into question how classical design, once symbolic of democracy, has been appropriated by voices which seek to undermine such values in the present day. In contrast to white marble monuments, the exterior surfaces of each memorial portal are clad in charred wood, a finish that gives the wood a rich color and texture and makes the material stronger, more durable, and more resilient.
The entry portals recall the informal timber buildings of Camp Barker through wood-clad structures that allow for passage and shading. A continuous folded plane forms each portal's floor, walls, and roof. On the playground side, smaller side wings create habitable spaces that engage the scale of the child. A liner of brass, a material usually too precious for unsecured public space, invites reflection and casts a warm glow. Standing within the portal and looking into the brass surface, one can view the outline of one's own reflection and the surrounding colors, a kind of visible ghost that removes personal identity in favor of a shared human condition. The material narrative is augmented by a figural one. Artist Vinnie Bagwell developed a series of narrative bas-relief sculptures to more overtly convey the site's themes. The recessed sculptures, cast of blackened bronze to match the char, are set into the thickness of the folding portals and depict key figures, moments, and texts in African-American history. The project responds to Adrian Parr's charge that memorials might leverage the tension between past and present. In Parr's words, quote, "Memorial culture is utopian memory thinking, one where culture inhabits the disruptive dimension of traumatic memories, which also entails a little bit of forgetting, while simultaneously bringing forth a sense of agency. The utopian dimension of memorial culture simultaneously presents the movement of collective agency and the materiality of concrete life. Hence, at its most successful, it avoids monumentalizing the past, choosing instead to tension the past with the present while joyfully looking to the future." End quote. The Camp Barker Memorial germinates the site's contradictions for emotional impact. The memorial beacons to the elementary school. Abstract space frames narrative sculpture. Charred wood folds over a thin brass liner. Realities that might not readily coexist are forced to do so. The daily diversions of contemporary school children play out on a site where people once sheltered from captivity. It is contrast that makes the memorial a critical part of the elementary school campus. Present-day students may daydream of the children that learned on these grounds a century and a half prior, confronting the promise of emancipation, but a long road to equity ahead. In the context of 2021, that fight is visibly ongoing, and the memorial a reminder of what is at stake. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie and Kyle. I really appreciate your comments about that, and have lots to ask you about the notion of collaboration, but also about children and their engagement with the memorial, on a daily basis. But let's go to our next presenter. I'll save all the questions for the end. We will hear Shane Albrighton and Norman Lee, the co-founders of Recite.
Well, first of all, thank you, Renee. This has been an honor to be part of this discussion with all the wonderful designers, architects, and creatives here. My name is Norman Lee, and Shane Albert and I are part of a studio called Recite. We're based in Houston, Texas. Our work primarily focuses on public art. And a type of public art that focuses on narrative placemaking, which is a kind of a site-specific distillation of narrative through the built environment. The title of our piece, From Absence to Presence, is a commemorative to enslaved peoples located in St. Mary's College of Maryland, which is, for those of you who don't know where this is, it's located southeast of Washington, D.C. I think it's like an hour, 2-hour drive from Washington, D.C. This project was we were commissioned through a process of an RFQ and through a kind of short list and selected on the basis of that process. So to give a little context about the project, this emerged when St. Mary's College was building a sports stadium, and as part of their methodology, they before groundbreaking began, they since it's such a historical part of the country, they do archaeological survey. And the school actually has a wonderful archaeological, anthropological anthropology program. And through their excavation, they had found remnants of slave quarters, things like pot shards, buttons, bottles, tools, utensils. And it was at that point that Tawana Jordan, who was the president of the university, decided to shift the entire the sports stadium several hundred yards. And she had this vision of creating a commemorative, a memorial to the slaves that once worked and lived and fought on the site. And here you see images of students surveying and picking through and kind of analyzing and cataloging the various artifacts. And kind of through this process, developed this competition or RFQ, a call for artists to help visualize and kind of generate a proposal for the site. So early on in the process, they felt it was very important to have the site of this monument to be on the actual grounds of the excavation of where the artifacts were found. This was very controversial, even to the point of having a couple of our other fellow finalists wanting to have the piece be in a more secluded area. They felt it was very important to have it be in an area of quietude, but we felt it was really important to have it can be kind of connecting past and present in a very powerful way. So in our site visit, we started to kind of think about the site in terms of how it's changed its identity through this discovery. So what you see on this slide is a sketch of what the plantation, the arrangement, the location of the quarters might have looked like based on the location of the artifacts. On the right is really the kind of the current plan and of the sports stadium, the soccer field, which is now complete, but kind of showing that the tension between past and present. And we started to really look at this idea of erasure, of covering up, revealing as a very interesting process to give identity to this site. And what you see above these images are kind of evocations of kind of erasure poetry or kind of redaction poetry. What starts as a plantation field becomes a sports field, but through uncovering of the artifacts, there's a the type of field and the nature of the field is kind of out in the open. And that was really the nature of what this sculpture be. And this became the question that we asked as we move forward in the design development. So erasure poetry became really the basis of kind of where we moved from, became a springboard for our ideas, and kind of what you see here, the kind of arrangement of words started to really inform us of what it could be as a sculptural piece. So kind of what the definition of erasure poetry is taking an existing document and start redacting or blacking out words to create poetry. And often this is it's subverting the original purpose of the text, whether it's a document or an existing piece of poetry or a piece of music. This is one of the most notable or kind of famous examples of redaction poetry. It's a Declaration of Independence. This is a piece by Tracy K Smith, who was a former U.S. Poet Laureate. She took the document and subverted it and really created a document through the eyes of the slaves, through the slave experience, and it kind of taking something and kind of questioning, what is freedom? What is this freedom for? So it's a very kind of powerful, very few words, and really kind of convey this this idea of poetic subversion in a very, very interesting, dramatic and resonant way. At this time, we obviously we're not poets. We wanted to collaborate with a poet that was really on the same page in terms of a lot of these themes. And Quentin Baker out of Seattle, Washington, was an erasure poetry, did a lot of redaction poetry, and did a piece on a document on the Brig Creole, which is the largest successful slave revolt in American history. It was a document that talked about a slave ship that left from Richmond, Virginia, on its way to New Orleans, and it was commandeered by a slave named Madison Washington, and it was steered towards Nassau, and it was and 137 slaves were able to be freed on that island. His work started to move into the gallery space and using space to kind of express his erasure poetry. So it was a natural collaboration as we were kind of taking poetry and wanting to move into a kind of sculptural form. So the documents that we did a lot of research, meeting with faculty and going through local library, national libraries, and really found the document that would be fitting for this project was runaway slave ads. And we found them to be particularly poignant and really kind of resonant in the sense that at the same time, as you can see in these ads, they're very specific on describing what runaway slave, describing their personalities, kind of their sense of humor, but at the same time, it was described as, as property, and it was at the same time personal and impersonal, and really is this kind of example of chattel slavery and kind of what this level of dehumanization, it really evoked that for us. So over 400 runaway slave ads, Quentin started to form and create these pieces of poetry, and all these slave ads were specific to the Maple Broom plantation where this site is. So we had this foundation, this kind of overarching concept of erasure poetry, but then we wanted to kind of distill a certain kind of sculptural form. So during our site visit, we were really struck by these ghost frame, what they term ghost framed architecture, which are placeholders for buildings they knew existed on the site, but they didn't really know what they were for. So they kind of were these kind of generic placeholders, but to us, these really tended to feel like something becoming, a piece of architecture that was becoming, that was in stasis. Normally when you see kind of a framework, it's usually architecture that's being built. So this is a temporary form, but the fact that it's kind of snagged it became this very kind of potent sculptural basis for us. And the quarters themselves became symbolically really important for us, because in our research, activist Angela Davis had this wonderful kind of a description of what slave quarters were. They allowed slaves to live in privacy, away from the gaze of slave owners, and it was a space where they can truly be themselves as families, as humans, and it was really kind of a symbol of empowerment. It was at the same time they were prisoners, but at the same time they were able to kind of live their lives in kind of in quietude, in private, and a level of privacy. So we kind of took these ideas together, these kind of architectonic structures in the Erasure Poetry. And the Erasure Poetry, we do a lot of these kind of visual studies. They started to kind of evoke clapboards, or that kind of sense of becoming of a piece of architecture. And these are some of the images that we presented to stakeholders, and kind of how we developed this kind of sculptural notion. So what you see here, this is Dr. Jordan, Tawana Jordan, visiting the piece as it was being installed. So this is an image of the sculpture, and the materials that we used were a polished stainless steel, darkened Ipe wood, on a framework. And one of the ideas of this piece is that it is a sculpture in the round, it is a sculptural in a field, but at the same time, the reflections bring in and kind of incorporate the entire field, because the field is the subject really of the piece itself. So it's a distinctly individual point within the field, but it kind of brings in these viewpoints, brings in reflections, brings in this redacted poetry. So it kind of exists all in a single visual experience. So people in playing soccer nearby or having festivities, we wanted this language, this narrative to confront daily and present day life. Here's a close-up. One of the very powerful gestures that Quentin decided to do was incorporate names. Although a memorial of names was not called out for, but through these runaway slaves ads, they were able to, names were there. So as part of the poetry, he felt that there would be these names intermingled in that, and that created this very, very powerful, that we felt this kind of personalized element, and also combined with the kind of language of those runaway slave documents. And here you see this kind of almost surreal expression of reflection, and how it kind of melds into the landscape and really becomes part of the sky as well. The sky is reflected in it. So it's something that is, kind of truly from absence to presence. It's actually this act of materialization is something that the process becoming, memory that is becoming unearthed and distilled, is something that we felt that this piece, that we wanted this piece to accomplish.
And something Quentin was trying to achieve was to reclaim the names and reclaim the language and the slave ads and subvert that. And what happens when a viewer is standing in front of the sculpture, it's reflective. So not only is it conflating the space and the time, the past and the present, but the viewer will see their own face. The viewer will see themselves, and they will be forced with this confrontation to try and reconcile what their role is in this history. Where do they fit in this history?
And at night, it takes on a very different experience. It was really important that the slave quarters themselves did not allow the penetration within the space. Historic St. Mary's is filled with recreations of slave quarters, and we felt this as a counterpoint to that. It was really important to kind of preserve that notion of a private space. So the only indication of the kind of life within is a light, and that light is kind of projected through these words, these names, and it kind of expands throughout the field. So it incorporates the field as a canvas at night, and it also recalls the North Star. This kind of symbol of hope. The North Star is, as we know, the title of Frederick Douglass's newspaper, and also this image down at the bottom right in these pot shards that we found, this kind of starburst form symbol was found at a very high rate, higher than rate than would normally be, found through a random process. And it's speculated that this starburst symbol was something that was a part of this representation of the North Star. So we wanted this kind of light to really recall that.
And it was really important, this kind of dichotomy of experience that a viewer may have during the day and at night. At day, slaves would be in the fields toiling, they would be seen. And in the daytime, we want people to be introspective and think about that. But in the evening, they have their seclusion and they have their own life within these walls. And the viewer becomes, only able to bear witness to the resilience that is shining and penetrating through these words that are either now trying to be reclaimed.
And it's essentially, a vigil too. You see this counterpoint of the sports stadium, the soccer field, the lights, and this kind of being kind of in a counterpoint relationship that it has its own light. It brings its own attention, to the ground. So this idea of a kind of a vigil to the light, that even when the lights are turned off, that as you drive by, this becomes, this kind of eternal visual at night. So this kind of night and day relationship is really kind of creates this dialogue with kind of the life of a slave too. They're working during the day, toiling at night. They're kind of, they're existing as families within these quarters, so that it kind of connects with that kind of cycle of experience.
And it was a bold move to erect this monument in the middle of their sports field. Every time anyone goes out to a sports game or to play a game, they will be confronted by this. And so the memory will endure. It will be there. It will be a confrontation, and it will be a dialogue, foster dialogue.
As part of the commission, we had Quentin read the poetry, and so there is an element of a digital or a element where people can use a phone and go to and hear his reading as the poetry, because that is the spoken word is such a powerful thing. So we wanted to play a minute clip and have you read along and really kind of get a sense of the voice behind the poet, reading these, and keep in mind that these words were taken in sequence, with some of these weren't always slave ads, but that subversion is a very powerful and impactful experience.
A complex dark confined, carried by law through the unreason of time, a copper-colored apprehension. Who said run first? Who crawled midnight home? That thick scar, that reward paid to the low, the black, the unbelonging. Now notice is hereby given to the slow discharge of reason, to the defect of purchase and confinement. Your hold is frail and spare of flesh. We are the inner bone of a secret, broken for safe delivery, reunited under cover in a dark country. Now notice is hereby given to the well-worn anvil, to the cotton weighing down the tongue. There will be no return. No dollars given for the lost. Still the scythe, bury the fields under a homespun shawl, let no eyes rest upon them. It is the ordinary, the cut, the collected, the stiff, the scarred, the laughing, the somber, the polite, the slender. We run toward a self-made shore. We lurk with stars belonging to a bright black crown.
Thank you.
Norman and Shane, thank you very much. I've actually been to the memorial, so I have some questions about the experience of it being there, but also the real power of that erasure poetry, which I hope we'll get a chance to talk about a little bit. So our final presenters will be Julian Arrington and Dayton Schroeder. So Julian and Dayton, I'll go ahead and let you get your PowerPoint up and I'll go off screen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And while I get this going, I'll just say thank you so much for inviting us here, being part of this important conversation. And also want to just, before we get started, acknowledge the recent death, the murder of Dante Wright, who died for simply having an air freshener, hung from his car and being Black in America. And with that, just going to get started here. Julian and I will tag team through the presentation. So just a little bit of background. Society's Cage was born in the it was a grassroots effort, born in the aftermath of the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor murders. We wanted to do something to sort of contribute to the discussions that were happening in our profession and within our society, frankly, in reckoning with institutional racism and white supremacy. So many times we are conditioned to see these murders or the police who commit these murders as bad apples. And we see these shootings as anomalies. But Society's Cage contextualizes these murders, within the 400-year history of racialized state violence in America. We wanted to avoid cliches. We wanted to avoid the feel-good monument or the nostalgic experience where everyone kind of comes and pats each other on the back for being great people. We really wanted to seize this opportunity and moment to provide a teachable opportunity and inspire and mobilize people into taking action. We got started with this process in early June, I believe, shortly after George Floyd's murder. So in less than 3 months of time, we conceived of a concept. We became our own client. We had to secure a physical site. We had to fabricate this thing. We had to build a fundraising platform. We had to build a website, and we even commissioned a musical soundscape for the experience. This was I like to say a data-driven process, but it was also a process-driven design. And the data was driven by questions. The first question that we asked was, what is the value of Black life? What societal structures have impacted Black life? What are the historic patterns of those societal structures? What are the, if any, the racial and gender discrepancies inherent in those patterns? And that ultimately led us to the institutions of lynching, mass incarceration, capital punishment, and police killings. So in essence, Society's Cage became a physical response to a series of queries. And with that, I'll turn it over to Julian to talk a little bit more about the concept.
Okay, so this is a concept diagram that's set to kind of portray where we started, our big idea, and where we ended up. So it's all about really expressing this juxtaposition. So it started with this cube, and the cube was representative of this idea of equity, fairness, and a perfect society. So what's happening is we're expressing the juxtaposition of that, which is the void and the lack of equity and fairness, and the sort of bearing the weight of the Black experience through this juxtaposition. So what's happening is, as Dayton described in the previous slide, is there's 4 different forms of state violence that we're conveying with data. And the idea is that it's expressing this 4-dimensional continuum, that regardless of where you are in history, there's this continuous force as a Black American that you're faced to experience that it sort of bears on you. So the ceiling surface is the convergence and the triangulation of those 4 different sets of data. And the way we're conveying the information is through the use of these rods. There's 484 rods. And not only are they used as a utility for to convey the data, but they're also sort of metaphorical, they're intended metaphorically to kind of represent some of the what do you call it, the structures, the societal structures that impede upon us. So 1 in 4 of those rods actually physically sort of hangs just above the ground plane. And the intent is to represent that 1 in 4 Black Americans over the course of their life is expected to be incarcerated. So we like to always show the renderings, even though, you know, it's a real thing now. But we felt like the renderings do a good job of kind of describing the intent, which we think was successful in the actual execution. But it's a 2-part experience. So it's all about sort of conveying the data and really telling the story, but then also giving people, you know, this emotive experience that you get from the inside. So right now you're looking at the exterior of the pavilion, and it's intended that you really sort of circumambulate around the space and read stories, read accounts. So each sort of platform has an account, a statistic, and a what do you call it? Sort of a descriptive element that sort of describes the form of state violence. So after somebody sort of circles around the pavilion and reads the stories and takes the information in, we want them to go inside and experience it. But the intent, as you see in the renderings, is that it's a sort of colored experience. And through the lens of the pavilion, you're able to see the context in a new and meaningful way. So the interior is as we described before, is the sort of convergence of those elements that you're feeling inside. Dayton alluded to the soundscape. So there's also a soundscape that's a part of the experience. It's 8 minutes and 40 seconds long in commemorates of George Floyd. And over the course of those 8 minutes and 46 seconds, there's 4 movements. And each movement is basically a musical rendition of different forms of state violence. And if you listen to the soundtrack or the track, you'll hear the sort of transitions in that music. As you could see, the texture on the ground is actually, what do you call it? About 10,000 names. So it's 10,000 names of different victims of the different forms of state violence that we're depicting. And the intent is really to give you the breadth, the sort of the legacy, and it's this weight, this texture is really about like the sheer abundance of all these different names. And the path is led by these different luminaires, and the luminaires are speaking on different forms of state violence. And the intent is to kind of lead you through the experience, and the lighting sort of reminiscent of the North Star or leading somebody through refuge. So the sort of conjunction of those two are intended to kind of guide you through the experience. Dayton, I don't know if you wanted to talk about the breathing exercise.
Yeah, I'll add on a little bit, and I think, you know, just in retrospect, the exterior experience is really meant to be an emotional trigger to really kind of provoke the visitor emotionally, so that once they enter the pavilion, we ask that everyone sort of take part in an exercise where they hold their breath for as long as they can. In reference to the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that George Floyd suffered at the hands of police, and to essentially record a short video stating how long they were able to hold their breath, and to provide a few reflective statements in the moment on how they feel, and then to share that video or share a statement on social media with the hashtag society's cage. So in many ways, what this is intended to do is sort of, almost broaden the base of conversations even beyond our visitors, to inspire our visitors to bring this to social media so that they can begin to have conversations, difficult conversations sometimes, with friends and family, because we feel that the visitor is actually most equipped to be able to have those important conversations around reconciliation and understanding.
So the first installation was on the National Mall, and as we like to describe, sort of in the same in the same light that I talked about before, in representing your context in a different way. We like to place this installation in context of elements of importance in the timeline of social injustice. So the monument kind of represents notions of democracy and the Capitol notions of, I don't know, Dayton, I'm quoting you, I don't know if you want to jump in here and take that.
Well, I'll even say even before this, I mean, we had aspirations, to put this installation on Black Lives Matter Plaza, because in many ways that was happening in parallel to what we were doing. And at the same time, as we were planning this and kind of hopefully, planning this, not knowing if we're going to be able to pull it off or not. The 2020 March in Washington came on our radar, which was set for August 28th, I believe. So we figured it would be ideal to get this installation up and running to take advantage of the critical mass of people for that event. And we were not able to get the installation put on the Black Lives Matter Plaza because all public permits were essentially halted because of COVID, the quarantine. However, the National Park Service was still processing applications. So coincidentally, there was a group who had reserved this location on the National Mall. We submitted an application and it just worked out, that the timing worked out, and we're able to position ourselves literally at the center of the National Mall, on axes with the National Monument and the Capitol building, to the east, Trump Hotel to the north, so it's really kind of like literally at the crosshairs of these really powerful symbols of democracy, law, freedom, and crony capitalism, for lack of better terms, to the north. So it was a really powerful site, and really allowed us an opportunity to get exposure to a broad base of visitors that we had originally never anticipated. Because in many ways, I think in our vision to put this on Black Lives Matter Plaza, we would have just been preaching to the choir. We often describe this installation as the shape of racism. It in many ways is shaped by data that describes how African Americans have been impacted by these four institutions of racialized state violence. So here's a great photo where you can actually start to see the data that's kind of formed in profile, and how that manifests itself, experientially on the exterior of the edifice.
So we like to describe the pavilion sort of two modes as well. The daytime, as Dayton was describing, is really a good time to kind of read the data and read the form. It's really an expression of that data and the form that it takes. But then at night, it becomes sort of a sanctum where visitors are able to kind of come in and they get this moment of solace where they could get some sort of refuge from the context. And Dayton and I and others at times stayed there overnight. We were required to sort of observe the pavilion 24/7 during the installation on the mall. And ourselves and others in our office volunteered to stay there overnight, and people came at all times of the night. So there were people there at 2 a.m. And we found that people that visited later in the night sort of spent more time, I'm stealing from Dayton, they kind of felt like they were cloaked in a way, so that, it separates yourself from the context where you don't feel like you're being judged. But we found that the experience is kind of a two-part thing, where some people even came back and they experienced it twice in totally different ways.
Yeah, I think, I think the cloak of night, of darkness, kind of really afforded a lot a lot more intimacy and privacy. And we found that people would be here all throughout the night. We'd be there at 4 o'clock in the morning, 4 a.m., and there'd be people, crowded around this thing. Ironically, we like, wow, and on a couple occasions I passed a couple people and they were crying, So it was just a really powerful experience at night as well. And as I mentioned, we were able to literally, draw in a really wide variety of users at this location. We were also positioned here at the tail end of the RNC commission, for the reelection of Trump, that was happening at the White House a few blocks away. So we also got that crowd, and literally everyone who passed the site, we had these interpretive panels that were set up at the periphery of the site to inform people about what this installation was, and so they would stop there before they came to the installation itself, and you could sort of tell from everyone's sort of body language, what their politics was, how they, depending on how they reacted to the synopsis of the installation. But without fail, 99.9% of the time, just irregardless of their politics, they came forward and they took this in. They took the experience in, and it was, I think we had a pretty good success rate with people's level of satisfaction for what they actually saw here. I mean, I know we need to probably speed this up. Well, as part of this installation, we also saw that there was we kind of discovered that there was this incredible opportunity to invite other social justice focused artists into this space. So we experimented with interpretive dance, poetry, and music inside the space. So I think, let's see if we'll just do this is just a quick video. I won't show you the whole thing. But this is a video of Yari Delincourt, who is a trained Albanelli dancer, who's sort of performing an 8-minute, 46-second interpretation of the death of George Floyd to the 8 minutes and 46-second soundscape that was created for the installation, themed around those 4 categories of racialized state violence. So I'll just show you a quick snippet of this so you can kind of get a flavor for the interpretive potential of this.
The audio is a little faint. I don't know.
Oh, the audio's not playing?
Yeah.
Well, if the audio's not playing, I'll just talk over it a little bit. But here, this is us positioned on the National Mall. And that's all I'll play. Sorry, apologies. I may have neglected to select the audio function on the presentation. Must have forgot when we logged on. But if you're interested, you can go. You can search for that. I believe it's on YouTube. You type in, Society's Cage, Yari Delincourt, you can find that. And we probably should just rush through. The next site was the War Memorial Plaza in Baltimore, Maryland. As we mentioned, this is a traveling installation. So this was there back in October for Architecture Month. And so here you could kind of see Julian and I with Mayor-elect Brandon Scott, who came out and toured the installation. We have plans to travel the installation to all the major cities: New York, Chicago, LA, San Francisco, New Orleans, Miami, for sake of reaching a critical mass. But we will also go to sites of conscience like Tulsa. We will be in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in May of this year for the 100-year centennial of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. There's also discussions of bringing this to Richmond, Virginia, which also has had its, it's the former, the former capital of the Confederacy, and is also sort of, grappling with notions of reconciliation, racial reconciliation around some of the monuments on Monument Avenue, and how to move forward as a city. And, we are ideally, we're looking for sites of power, with historically significant buildings and, monuments and structures that relate to justice, law enforcement, et cetera. And also African-American, sites of trauma and resilience. In many ways, we think of the pavilion as a lens for reframing our view of established historical structures, within the context of the history of racialized state violence. And in many ways, it allows the visitor to see things from the perspective of the oppressed. I used to be a big fan of Howard Zinn, and this notion of the people's history, people's history, the view of telling history from the perspective of the people. So in many ways, that's what this is. As we travel the installation, there will be plenty of opportunities to, personalize the content, tell local stories. It allows for, people in each city to kind of just, personalize the experience and make it their own, so to speak. And Julian, chime in if I'm missing. I'm just trying to rush through because I know we're tight on time.
I don't know if you mentioned that this is the Civil War Memorial. I know it said it, but.
Yes, sorry. So yeah, we're positioned on the War Memorial Plaza in between City Hall and the War Memorial Building and the police station in central Baltimore. So again, we're on another site of power, and it's just an incredibly beautiful experience to sort of come here. This is also part of a fundraising campaign. So we are partnered with the AIA Architectural Foundation's Diversity Advancement Scholarship Program. And we had been working with them throughout this process to raise money for tuition for historically disadvantaged students. So that's also part of this. And I like to always conclude by saying, we took the ugliness of racism and rendered it in a beautiful way to allow people to have uncomfortable but necessary conversations about racial reconciliation. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Really interesting. I think we're going to have a lively conversation. So we're going to get everybody back onto the gallery view so that we're all here. And if you could turn back on your cameras and maybe just click on the microphone when you're about to talk so we don't get a lot of ambient sound in the background. That might work best. So I have a few questions, but I also want to just say for those participants, if you have questions for these design practitioner, landscape, architects, kind of creatives, please put your questions in the Q&A and I will get to them. But I'll start off the conversation. And if not, I'll just keep talking because I have lots of things to ask you all. But if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and Catherine and I will be monitoring. So the first question, I have kind of two ideas actually. One is one of the things that's a little bit from the question that I initially posed to you, but I want to think about this a little bit. And if you could all respond in some ways, because it seems that it came through listening to all of you, and particularly Katie and Kyle, you use this language. But do you consider yourselves working in these kind of counter anti-monument form? Is that what's happening in your process? So you're really trying to go against, let's say, the bronze and marble that we're so used to seeing in space. And what does it mean to do something that is effectively an anti-monument or a counter-monument?
Yeah, so a lot of, it's interesting, we're public artists, so a lot of times that mandate comes, from the art commissioners, is that we don't want bronze, we don't want that, they have various reasons for wanting to do that. But I think the language of bronze and kind of figuration, and sometimes, it's applicable, but I think this idea, and we actually use this a lot of the talks about the St. Mary's Project is that when you see figurative forms of a generic, let's say a firefighter, or which is the typical kind of firefighting memorial, it tends to push the narrative back in time. It tends to kind of distance the viewer from that history, and there's just kind of it's an archetype. You see a bronze figure, you think past, it doesn't relate to us anymore. So often with the materials that we choose in the forums, reflectivity, kind of words interlaced, with one's reflection, some kind of engagement, some kind of interactivity, what that does is bring the past in the present, and that's something that we do intentionally in our work. So this kind of twofold, some of them is just people have a very kind of an aversion to this historical forms, and and other times we want to be a little more specific in the narrative and kind of bring things forward and create a dialogue.
Right, and I would just add to that those types of monuments, yes, they are often very static, and they are preserving a very specific, narrow set of values, perhaps. Mm-hmm. And so by incorporating an experience, like a common shared experience that is out of the ordinary, you can elicit some sort of visceral reaction from people. And that causes them to feel. And when they feel, they start to think, and then they start to talk. There's nothing wrong with how you feel, but why you're feeling that way may be different than why someone else is feeling that way. So that's something that we feel could engage people and kind of foster this open dialogue and unity, and maybe understanding, through the lens of contemporary art, because it also has to be, visually interesting, has to be visually appealing, but it has to have some kind of message. And so we are all about preserving history, revealing history through non-linear ways than we're used to. We're not making a documentary. We're not historians. We're not building a museum here. We're building an experience to open that doorway, because history connects us through time. And basically understanding the link between past and present is absolutely basic for a good understanding of the human condition.
Mm-hmm.
I'll add to that. I mean, I think for me, at least personally, we didn't want the object to kind of get lost in the movement. We're a grassroots operation in the case of Society's Cage. And as I mentioned, the entire process began with questions for us. And we wanted to really avoid the sort of cliches and trappings of that feel-good monument and experience that produces nostalgia and immediate gratification. So we purposefully avoided precedents and conceptual sketches in our process, because we also didn't want to presuppose or adopt ideas that weren't produced as a result of our linear process. And this required a great deal of vulnerability and trust in allowing for the process to naturally dictate, the final outcome. So, the architectural language for us had to be capable of communicating the historic data, but also it was timely in that it had to allow for a safe, COVID-resistant, open air environment. Mm-hmm. So we ultimately chose steel pipe because they inherently have that graphic quality that's capable of expressing historic, line graph data. And we also, because we were a fundraising operation, we were relying on fundraising. We also saw it as an opportunity to leverage support from like-minded, building industry partners. So the idea of using steel pipe, which is actually electrical conduit, and is a common building material. And that was part of our strategy of sourcing material that could be readily available to some of our industry partners, and a material that we could acquire in short order. We didn't have the luxury to be a bronze, monument or statue, nor did we want to be, because it would have distracted from the bigger purpose of what we were doing.
I'm gonna say, just to add on or piggyback on what Dayton was saying, funny enough, we never really defined what our installation was. Like even to this day, when I said installation, it kind of varies from conversation to conversation what we kind of define it as. Because as Dayton kind of described, it's about this malleable experience, and it kind of changes from place to place. And even speaking on that topic of materiality, as Dayton kind of alluded to, we actually researched a few different materials, and our budget was pretty limited. So that's not the reason why we ended up with the steel conduit, but it was part of the overall narrative in terms of what was regularly available. But I feel like it worked out in many ways because it was more about the intent and the experience, as everybody kind of alluded to prior to me speaking. But it's this constant sort of changing event that we wanted to really get across. And as the installation begins to travel across the country, as Dayton alluded to before, we want to begin to incorporate stories that are specific to the different environments that we enter into.
Katie and Kyle?
Yeah. It's really interesting to hear I guess to kind of see this as a connective thread between the three works as well. But yeah, for us, the kind of differentiating what this was from the icons of DC was really important, and really defining a visual language that was not only maybe different, but also explicit in its rejection of the symbolism, of a kind of classic DC white marble monument. And so the materiality really came from there and became a kind of driving force in the design. But I think, it was important to us to think about it in multiple ways. It comes across in the material, but it's also in terms of how it engages the urban fabric, how it reaches out to the periphery, and becomes something that even if you're not going to the elementary school, or even if you're not going to the public park, you become conscious of. So that's something that I think is really powerful in the other two projects as well. Dayton and Julian's location on the National Mall, right? That gets people who are coming for these other monuments, and then they actually get kind of caught by this temporary piece that they didn't expect, right? And then, Shane and Norman really putting this thing in tension with the sports fields, and even having it kind of bleed out light, so it starts to take up more area than the physical footprint of the piece, I think is really powerful.
Thank you. And one thing, since I have not seen the Society's Cage, but Katie and Kyle, what's really struck me about your memorial, and then I'll come back to a bigger question, but one question I did want to ask you specifically was the relationship to the school, because it is fascinating to hit that block that is at 9th and I can't remember the exact address. I had to actually, first of all, kind of do a little hunting to find it. And then I realized, oh, it's part of the school grounds. Like that, like all of a sudden I had to make this huge shift in mind about what I thought this was going to be. And Vinnie Bagwell actually is going to speak next week. So I think it's interesting that she did the low release for you. But in fact, there is this, with both your work and the work that Shane and Norman, and as well as Dayton and Julian showed us, this idea of that reflectivity of that engagement with the object that requires the visitor to become immersed in an experience at the school. So I guess my question to you is really at the school. I was there when a lot of kids, even though it was COVID, there were a lot of kids on the playground. I'm not sure they were supposed to be there, but there were a lot of kids on the playground. And I was really struck about how they're just using that space, but also kind of interacting with those gateways. So if you could talk a little bit about there had to have been some conversation with Garrison Elementary, I would hope. So what was going on there with the children and how they conceive of that space, and maybe what they're learning about that legacy that their school sits upon?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I'll say that I think that when the project started, it was sort of in response to a brief that was primarily aimed at making a series of entry portals for the school. And there was a little bit of information there about, oh, there's this historical significance of the site, but it wasn't maybe a primary focus for the project, from the sort of clients and arts organization. And so that's something that we really wanted to bring into the project and say that, we have to grapple with that history on the site. It would be kind of a disservice to not kind of reveal that history in some way, because otherwise there's sort of no visible trace of it on the site today. But that like duality of dealing with the elementary school at the same time, exactly as you say, you have to walk through any of the three portals to get to the school grounds, and it's a pretty popular area. Like those sports fields and everything are just used by the neighborhood at other times, and so the challenge of dealing with those two maybe totally different programs or users or histories simultaneously was central to the project, and the idea that there's like a lived-in quality to the site. So we have an abstraction of the folded form of the portals, recalling somehow the collection of like pitched roofs of the buildings that were the barracks turned housing of Camp Barker, and thinking about how people once lived on this site in those buildings, and now there's sort of children coming to learn on that site and needing to kind of interact or sort of experience these sculptures in a very different way than you would encounter an equestrian statue up on a pedestal, right? So there's a kind of interaction, a kind of maybe playfulness, but also kind of like lived-in experiential quality that we were interested in exploring.
With you both, with the Camp Barker Memorial, but also with the From Absence to Presence, there is this reflectivity. One of the things that really struck me about From Absence to Presence and visiting it, there are moments, well, first of all, we drove by it because it had dissolved into the atmosphere. I don't know quite how to explain that, but literally the way that the mirrors work at a given time of day, and it was a very clear blue sky day, we didn't see it. So, and then I saw a glint of reflection. And so we drove all the way back, circled all the way back, came in. So that for me is already really interesting, that the mirror reflections, there's moments like when the chimney disappears into the sky. Like that's a really like the dissolving quality of that memorial is very striking to me. But I also think your discussion of that idea of the interior that we cannot access is super intriguing, because of course I took my camera and wedged it up against the edge so I could shoot into being very nosy, trying to get into the interior. But that actually, that limitation that we can't quite enter that space, I think is really important about your memorial.
Yeah, I mean, when we did the site visit, we were given a tour of various slave quarters, and we saw in the meticulous detail these recreations. Kind of where they had their herbs. Where they had an area where they hid things. Kind of contraband items. So it was all well created, kind of where they slept, and so there was that kind of element of this. And that's where that notion of kind of stepping in the past. So when you go in historic St. Mary's, that's the desire. You want to step back in time. So we're very conscious about, this idea of kind of using this language that's very common, not only in ghost frames, but in these kind of recreated slave quarters, kind of use that symbol, but kind of subvert it, kind of make it a way where you can't go inside it, you can't penetrate it. And then by the very nature, you're kind of, it's in your presence, you're reflected in it. So that became, the more we thought about it, the more it kind of tied in, and it kind of made sense, and created this counterpoint with all these aspects of not just the site, but all the kind of the other plantations in the area. So yeah, that was something that was really important as we developed the idea.
So, and then I think I want to ask Dane and Julian, but while I ask this, I want you all to think about this bigger question, because what I really am interested in is, how does the work that you're doing here? So the reason I invited you, and then I'll get to this very specific question to Dayton and Julian, but the bigger question is, I invited you because I have been noticing designs groups getting into the memorial business, is what I would call it, right? That there are a group of very traditional academic sculptors who I interviewed some of them last week, but there are a larger number of them in my project. There are artists who are doing kind of ephemeral interventions. Let's say Ada Pinkston or Becky Davis are doing these ephemeral interventions into the space, right? So that kind of transitory encounter, but if we see the performance, it impacts us to thinking about this memorial space differently. So I guess my big question is, like, how does memorial building or monument building fit into like a design architectural practice? And so think about that. And then I wanted to ask, and maybe this is true of all of you as well, is that question about how it fits in your design practice. But also I was really curious, particularly with Dayton and Julian's work, of it perhaps as almost a memory device, that we encounter this, we see the bars, it's this data, but also we're kind of internalizing the data as we leave. You talk about that emotional experience, and we can get to the sensorial that's present, the sensorial and haptic that's present in all of your work. But could you kind of talk about your work, if you see it as a memory device, or am I going too far to think of it as that in that way with Dayton and Julian, with Society Cage in particular?
No, I think you're absolutely right in what this is. I mean, it's twofold. I think in many regards, part of why we did this was because we felt there was an absence of authenticity and voice in doing this, and we were so moved by this murder. That we felt we had to do something, and oftentimes in the memorialization industry, we as Black architects find ourselves alienated from our own history. So many others are oftentimes brought in to kind of reconcile our history for us, which I find incredibly audacious in doing this work. It's tantamount to like an arsonist showing up with a fire truck to put out the fire, right? So one of the reasons we did this project is because Black architects are really rarely hired to do serious work with the memorialization of Black sites of trauma and resilience. So, we not only designed this, but we also had to raise the funding and find a site and establish partnerships to make it happen. No one sort of hired us to make that happen. Yeah. And then, second, I would say, that this work, it's part of reparative justice. It's really where I kind of lean, and a lot of the work I do, in fact. But it's laying the foundational steps for the repair of the psychosocial economic injury that has resulted from the disruption caused by the transatlantic slave trade. So at its best, this work is really about bringing us together to tell a more complete story of our history. But it's also about elevating those spaces and stories that have impacted and shaped African American life, African American experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as Dayton described, when we first started, it was very important to us that we were the authors, and that the messaging remained consistent through the project. And we even identified ourselves as almost like vessels to tell the story in a way, because we didn't really want us as individuals to be highlighted through the storytelling fruit. And in the sense that, as you alluded to in terms of memory, that this is a thread and a continuum, and that we wanted people to begin to, as Dayton said, begin to catalyze and change things. And this is really about generating empathy in the hopes that people will begin to feel a certain way and want to go out there and begin to make change. So that was really the intent behind it continuously traveling, and also the intent behind the different site placements.
So I just have to say, and then I want to go back to this bigger, first of all, Dayton, I really hear you around this issue of Black architects. I am fascinated, for example, that Rodney Leon has created like these two enormous, fairly traditional, because I was just talking about them today in class, memorials in New York City, the African Burial Ground and the Ark of Return, as a Black architect. But indeed, I think this issue of, this comes up in my project a lot, like who are the artists that are being selected for these commissions, and then how does this really work, and what are the implications for narrative, but also thinking about these hard truths about the past, and whether it be about mass incarceration and lynching, or about slavery, and who is telling those stories. Is really also essential, I think. And I'm wondering if overall you could address this issue of unless it's just, I'm imagining the design practitioners and architects are entering this in new ways. It's just a trend I've noticed. I've been working on my project for about a decade, and then bam, all of a sudden I'm like, where are all these design practice groups coming from in the last kind of 5 years? So if you want to address that in some ways about how this fits within the body, because some of you are actually building buildings, right? You're architects. And Dayton, you and I were talking about the wharf development, building a hotel. So how does this social justice work, which I see your projects on different levels engaging the issue of social justice? How does that work within the larger frame of what you do?
So for me, personally, I've been for the last 3.5 years, I've been involved in a project that we're calling the National Museum of Slavery at the Lumpkin Slave Jail. It will be a new museum built around the historic archaeological remains of the historic slave jail in Richmond, Virginia. And so in doing that work, it sort of had, lack of better terms, moved me into an emotional space where I have been processing so much of these things. And I never considered myself to be an artist. That's not how that wasn't the approach I took. I'm an architect who works very, very intimately with data. I use data as a tool of design. I also use data as a tool of production. And in many ways, our introduction to this world was really in many ways done blindly. Just like literally stumbled in, not even knowing and understanding the historical climate or space that we were sort of entering into. Because it's like the minute we did this, people were like calling us artists, and I never heard that before. And in my mind, when we were doing this, I thought that we were creating an outdoor museum experience during the quarantine on the National Mall, in the absence of all our national museums being shut down. That we were somehow supplementing our popular consciousness, our popular consciousness with this incredible interpretive experience to help people process and understand the murders, within the contextual history of racialized state violence in our country. I didn't give it a whole lot of thought. I just thought we had something to say. that was important to be said, and if I could be quite frank, just to cut through the bullshit, there's so many monuments that are just these wasted opportunities, these cliche moments, and people show up, they come around, they smile, everyone feels good, and I'll be totally honest, even when we presented the concept that you see today. Internally within Smith Group to try to get support for it, financial support and backing and so on and so forth. There are a lot of people, even in our institution, in our company, who weren't comfortable with it because it's not an experience that it's not an easy experience, for lack of better terms. It's an experience that really kind of pulls the visitor out of their comfort zone and challenges them to reconcile with this difficult history. But at the same time, it does so in a way, I think, that's very disarming. So most people, they're drawn into the experience, not even really knowing and understanding what they're really about to encounter. And before you know it, they're immersed in it, and they're learning and they're understanding. And out of that, we're able to generate, a greater human connection and understanding. People were appreciative of actually being pulled out of their comfort zone. And ultimately what we're here to do, we want to enhance, our collective awareness of the world we inhabit, and ultimately challenge people to be better citizens. And that was the mandate. That was the goal. Educate, create empathy, and hold people accountable, and give them the tools and resources to do that.
I'll be quick.
Sorry, I don't know.
No, you're fine. The installation is definitely an anomaly in our practice. It's not something that like the firm overall is into necessarily, or at least as far as I know, plans to get into. Dayton, myself, and others have discussed the possibility of continuing to do things similar. But it's, as Dayton suggested, it's very important that we convey that we get it across that we're architects in practice, firstly. And recently, to answer your question, we've been getting a lot more RFPs and things of the sort, asking for projects that are along the lines of restorative justice, including a recent project that I can't disclose that we just won, and the one that Dayton alluded, the Lumpkins slave jail, amongst others. So we are noticing that within the industry, a lot of institutions are beginning to identify their sort of legacy and their effect on what the past, the history was, and they're making more of it. We're seeing that people are starting to make more of an effort to effectively change that, hopefully.
Shane and Norma or Kate, thank you very much for that. It is interesting how it starts to beget more work, I assume, like once you do this, right? That's what I see when I check out your websites. It feels like you do that first thing and then all of a sudden it starts to snowball. But Katie and Kyle, or Shane and Norma, do you want to address this issue of how this fits in your design practice?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. When we read that question in your email, as we talk about how our firm has developed, it kind of fell right into kind of the narrative of our firm. So we started, or I before Recite, I did monuments and memorials, as kind of public art pieces. Shane and I are both interpretive environment designers for museum exhibits, so a very didactic approach to the built environment. But then, we wanted to kind of create stories in a way, and this idea of what Julian mentioned about being vessels and kind of storytellers, it's not our, it's not our story, necessarily. It's not our preferred use of materials or a form that we like. We're taking the site-specific narrative and kind of creating this thing, right? So when we started with memorials and monuments, we did police memorials, firefighting memorials, and then as our public art practice developed, we were kind of winning commissions that had to do with cultural diversity, multiculturalism, community identity. And I think with the rise of kind of Black Lives Matter and more kind of social activism, there's more calls that have dealt with the history of kind of civil rights, and these two forces kind of collided in our studio. So we had this kind of track record of doing pieces about multiculturalism and cultural diversity, but we also have this kind of line that deals with monuments and memorials. So these came together in the St. Mary's project. And just within the last couple of years, we're doing a lynching memorial in Dallas. We're doing a piece in Norfolk, Virginia, about the end of segregation, and we're doing a project in Atlanta on MLK Boulevard, on civil rights. So these have kind of emerged in a very prominent way. It's something that I personally have had an interest in. But just in terms of kind of what's out there, what RFQs are being put out there, there seems to be a real interest. And as Confederate monuments are going down, the effect that you see more memorials and monuments, kind of dealing with slavery, dealing with lynching, dealing with racial violence. So, and that's and so we're kind of caught in this moment. I think kind of St. Mary's was the first of the completed pieces that kind of deal with this. So, so that's something that we have a passion for, and collaborating, and people with Quentin. Tim Siebels is a poet that he was the poet laureate of Virginia. That we're collaborating him with the piece in Dallas. So that's how kind of we had interest, but then the outside forces of kind of what's going on in the world has really kind of facilitated this as well.
And we're at 5:30, but Katie and Kyle, if you could respond to this, and then I'll say a few things and we'll wrap it up. I could keep talking to you all, but if you could, if you want to respond, that would be wonderful.
I'll just maybe add briefly that I think maybe the fact that architects and designers are confronting these histories is really important and overdue. the built environment plays such a role in shaping these systems, you know, from redlining to like the mechanisms of property ownership to the materials that are used in various places, you know, to kind of environmental factors. So yeah, I think it's really important that we start to think about these things much more seriously and much more urgently in our work. And yeah, I think maybe that's just a good thing to have the discussion of space be tied to some of these issues you know, through the lens of memorials and beyond.
So thank you very much. It is 5:32. I see that the audience didn't ask questions, but you had plenty of really fascinating things to say. And the one last thing I would just note, because I do see that this idea of the sensorial and of the haptic of being so key to all of your work, and that is in fact, for me, where transformation can happen is that kind of engagement, that direct, sometimes bodily engagement with an object can make you think about the past in new ways, to think about your place with, let's say, systems of oppression, or to, in the case of you really have created in St. Mary's, down at St. Mary's College, it really is something in the round. I took a movie of it because you walk around it, and as you're moving around this object, you're really thinking about, like, what is this erasure poetry? What are those names? Why were there so many? First of all, there was a lot of runaways from Maryland, and they got extremely concerned about it in the 1850s, about the number of enslaved persons leaving plantation. Like, they met in these communities, both in southern Maryland and on the eastern shore, to figure out, like, how do we stop it? But the fact is that this compulsion, I mean, Maryland's in some ways very fortuitous that it's right on the border with Pennsylvania and Delaware, and they're pretty, you know, escape routes that were possible. But I am really interested in these immersive experience, in the haptic, and the notion of touch, of sound, of voices, actually, telling stories. So Shane and Norman, please get the poets' voices down there at that memorial, or a QR code, so we can listen to the poet, because that's really essential. His voice, or someone's voice reading that poetry as you're moving through the space, would be really powerful. So that's just my little plug. Yes, Shane, please.
It should be there soon. They're working on the QR code right now.
Okay, good. I'm super excited by that. So thank you all today. I will be back in contact with you to continue our conversation over the summer. But thank you for joining today, and I will be in contact. Be well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Great.
Bye.